Names are important to people, and as it turns out, they're pretty important to plants too. Let's talk about taxonomy. What's up, fellow plant enthusiasts? My name is Dylan, and this is Bain's Botanicals. Today, we're going to be talking about taxonomy. Now, this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I love when things are organized into a system. So I love the periodic table too. I don't even like chemistry, but I love the periodic table just because it's nice and neat and organized. Now, that's not to say that taxonomy can't get a little bit messy, but in general, it's a cool system, and it really helps us identify plants and see how they're related to each other. Now, before we get into that, we need to discuss the difference between a scientific name and a common name. Well, a scientific name is the official name given by the scientific community, and it places the plant into a hierarchical system that kind of helps us identify it. A common name is a name given by the general public, and the problem with common names is that they can vary from place to place or even person to person. For example, epiprenum usually goes by pothos or pothos, and it can also be called devil's ivy and probably a few other things as well. That doesn't help us zero in on a good name for the plant that everybody can identify it by. The other problem with common names is that they can be deceptive. They can kind of make a plant seem like something it's not. So, for example, Bocarnia. We know it as the ponytail palm, but it's not related to palms at all. It's actually a succulent. Another example would be cycas, which is what we know as the sago palm, but cycas is much, much older than palms, and it's not even in the same universe almost as palms. So common names like that can kind of deceive us a little bit. And the reason that can affect plant care is because palms actually like to be watered quite frequently and allowed to dry out quickly, but with succulents, you don't water them that much. And with something like a cycas, you don't really water it that much either. So watering it too much because you think it's a palm could be a problem. So I encourage you guys to know the scientific names of your plants. Even if you don't know the species name, at least know the genus it's in, because that's what we usually identify plants by, their genus. So like ficus and epiprenum and syndapsis and philodendron, those are all names of different genera, which can kind of help us identify how to take care of the plant. It's also the name that you'll see on the plant tag most likely when you go shopping. But yeah. So to kind of get into taxonomy, it really starts with a guy named Carl Linnaeus. And he was a Swedish biologist. He was also a physician, and he was just a really smart, curious guy. And he came up with this system called binomial nomenclature. And I know that sounds technical, but when you break it down, binomial just means two names, and nomenclature is just kind of a naming system. Now, all of this takes place in the 1700s, and he became so famous that he is known as the father of modern taxonomy. Now, that's not to say that Linnaean taxonomy is the only way to identify things. There are other methods, but Linnaean seems to be what most people can relate to. It's also what we just have known the longest. I mean, it's been 300 years, and for the most part, it works. Now, as science has advanced a little bit and we've gotten more into like genetics and DNA, we can kind of see things that we couldn't see before. And certain plants have common lineages that we didn't know about before. So sometimes certain plants have to be moved into different groups because it makes more sense. It's the only thing that makes sense scientifically. This happens and has happened recently with Sansevieria getting moved into Dracaena. Or another classic story is how Epiprenum and Syndapsis were both a part of the genus Pothos, and they got split out of it just because it didn't make sense to have them there anymore. They didn't have as much in common as we thought they did. So it can happen both ways. Sometimes things get split apart, sometimes things get grouped together. I'm going to turn this. It's kind of annoying me. So we're going to keep this as simple as possible because with anything scientific, you can always go deeper and deeper and deeper and make things more complex. We're going to make this really simple, and we're only going to look at the main 7 levels of Linnaean taxonomy. Now there are sub-levels and levels above certain things, and you can get into that and it can just get very technical, but we're going to keep it simple. So the top layer of Linnaean taxonomy is going to be kingdom. And depending on the country you're in, or whatever scientists you talk to, there are 5 or 6 kingdoms. And the reason there's 5 or 6 is because the bacteria kingdom is sometimes split into 2. But the other 4 kingdoms are Kingdom Animalia, that's animals, Kingdom Plantae, the plants, Kingdom Fungi, that's going to be all the fungus and mushrooms and molds and things. And then Kingdom Protista is kind of the kingdom where everything else goes that doesn't belong anyplace else. So the protists don't have that much to do with each other as much as they just don't belong anywhere else. But that's a whole separate video. For example, if there was a bacteria, or a bacterium, I guess would be singular, and for some reason it photosynthesizes, well, it's not really a bacteria, but it's also not a plant, so then they make it a protist. That's a very rudimentary example, but that's kind of the long and short of it. So we're only going to focus on the plant kingdom. So the next step down from that would be the phylum. And with plants, you might hear it sometimes called division, but I'm just going to keep calling it phylum because that's what makes the most sense. That agrees with everything else. And usually at this moment in time, there are about 10 different phyla within the kingdom Plantae. Now, if you guys have been following my channel for a while, I always put the taxonomy information when I do plant care videos, just so you guys can kind of see that information and see where your plant fits into the tree of life, if you want to call it that. And the top layer that I always put, well, we know it's in the plant kingdom, so I always start with the phylum. And most of our plants fall into Magnoliophyta, because Magnoliophyta are the flowering plants. And flowering plants are the most successful plants of all. And once they started, it was kind of hard to stop them because flowers are customized to be pollinated by certain creatures like insects and birds. Some of them are just wind pollinated, and they were able to disperse so efficiently and so rapidly, they quickly became the dominant plant on Earth. I say quickly, it took millions of years, but that's still pretty fast. And there are hundreds of thousands of species in Magnoliophyta compared to, certain other phyla that only have maybe a few dozen or maybe only one. So if we kind of go backwards from Magnoliophyta, there's a group of 4 called the gymnosperms. And gymnosperm just means naked seed. They're kind of a step back evolutionarily, if that's a word, from the flowering plants. So these plants don't make flowers, but they do have seeds. So you're looking at Pinophyta, that's the pines. Sometimes you'll hear it called Coniferophyta, but I think Pinophyta is the official name. Cycadophyta, which we've talked about a little bit, like this Zamia is in Cycadophyta. Also the sago palm, sago plant. And then the Ginkgophyta, that's the one that only has 1 species in it. A whole phylum, and it only has 1 species in it because all the other species have gone extinct millions of years ago. And the fact that we have that 1 species is kind of amazing. We'll do a video talking more about that at some point, but ginkgo trees are really cool. And they call them a living fossil because if you ever go up and look at one, they do look very rudimentary compared to our common trees today, which are mostly flowering or pines. And they call it a living fossil because all of the other plants that are like that are fossils, which is just crazy to me. But anyway, so Pinophyta, Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, and then the last one is called Cnidophyta with a silent G. Cnidophytes are a weird little cluster of plants. They kind of look dead. I mean, I'll put a picture up, but they're kind of, a lot of them are endangered actually. They can live a long time, but they're weird. You guys should do some more research on them because they're just bizarre. None of them are houseplants, so it's not necessarily relevant to the channel, but it's still a cool thing. So we're going to take another step back. We've done 5. Next step back is going to be Lycopodiophyta, which is going to be spike mosses and club mosses. I'll put a picture up of those, but they're just kind of more rudimentary plants. They don't make seeds, but they do have a vascular system. The other one's going to be Polypodiophyta, and we actually have talked about Polypodiophyta before because Polypodiophyta has all the ferns in it. It also has something called horsetails. But yeah, all of our ferns are in Polypodiophyta. And then if we go another step back, now we're getting into the really rudimentary plants. So the most famous one would be Bryophyta, and that has all the moss and if you walk out into the forest and you see, that green carpet on the ground, that's a bryophyte. It's one of the mosses. And surprisingly, there are tens of thousands of species. I don't know how scientists managed to identify that many of something so basic, but you also have Anthoceratophyta, which are the hornworts, and then you have, I had to write it down, Marchantiophyta, which is the liverworts. Those used to go by a different name, so I had to learn the new name. But yeah, and those are just, again, those are plants that are really basic. They don't make seeds, they don't make flowers, and most importantly, they don't have a vascular system. So these are like the first plants that came onto land way back when, and that's why they're so basic. That's kind of where we had to start in order to progress all the way through to get to where we are today with vascular systems and flowers and seeds and things like that. So those are the 10. Most of those are not relevant to houseplants, but I kind of wanted to just go through them real quick. So from now on, we're going to only focus on Magnoliophyta for this video, just so that I can give examples. So the next step down from phylum is class. And in Magnoliophyta, in general, there are only two classes, which are Liliopsida, which you might also hear called the monocots, and Magnoliopsida, which you might also hear called the eudicots. And the main difference between these two is basically how complex the parts of the plant are. Monocots usually only have like flower parts in threes. Just like their structures are usually a little bit more simpler. Their flowers in general aren't very impressive. And with eudicots, the inflorescences are much more elaborate. The flower parts are usually in fours, fives, or more. It could be many. And just in general, they tend to be bigger plants as well. Like most of our trees are eudicots, or they're in the class Magnoliopsida. The exception being palm trees, which are actually in Liliopsida, but palm trees, not technically a tree, but that's a different video. You could also make a case of there being a third class, which would be called the basal angiosperms. These are like the most basic flowering plants that, I don't know, they kind of defy some of the rules, but like I said, we're keeping it simple. So monocots, eudicots. The next step down from that is going to be the orders. And we haven't really talked about orders much on this channel because orders they're kind of the middle, like they're right in the middle, right? So when you're right in the middle, sometimes you can't really get your bearings of where you're at. The best analogy I can give you would be like a book or a story. You can identify it by the beginning and, you can identify it by the ending. But sometimes when you're smack in the middle of it, it can be a little tricky to kind of figure it out. And orders are kind of like that when it comes to taxonomy. Well, at least when it comes to plant taxonomy. When we're talking about insects, for instance, orders are actually pretty important because they kind of point us in the right direction of where we're going. But as far as plant taxonomy goes, it just doesn't really mean that much. And part of the reason for that is because certain orders get moved around, certain families within the orders get moved around, and it's just kind of messy, and order's just not going to come up very much. The next step down from that is going to be family. We talked about families on here just because family can kind of show us how different genera, which are the main, identifiers of our houseplants, it can show us how the different genera fit together. So you've heard me talk about the aroid family and the Aralia family, the cactus family, and the family of palms, which is Ericaceae. when we look at them, we can kind of see how things relate together really well. Most plants in the cactus family, Cactaceae, are going to have the same kind of care. Most of the palms are going to have the same kind of care. Most of the aroids are going to have the same kind of care. And Araceae has probably 15 or 20 different genera of houseplants in it. So it's one of our fundamental families, really, when it comes to the hobby. Philodendron and Epiprimnum and Syndapsis and Aglaonema and Spathiphyllum. There's just so many. Eventually, I'll make a list, but I did make a list. I just haven't given it to you guys yet, because I did go through and I kind of made a houseplant family tree. I just need to refine it a little bit before I kind of get that to you guys. But yeah, so down from family, we're looking at genus. And like I said, when you go to a plant store, the plants are organized by genus. All of those things I just listed, in the family Araceae, those are all names of different genera. So if you learn nothing else about taxonomy, just learn the genus name of your plant, because that's what's going to help you the most, probably. And then the last step, the most specific one, is species. And species are just the different plants within a genus. So take this plant, for instance, this Ficus lyrata. We know that it's in the genus Ficus, and lyrata is the species, which is very different from a Ficus elastica or a Ficus benjamina or a Ficus pumila. Not so different that they're not related, but different enough that it's good to know the species too. Now, I am very guilty of not knowing all the species of my plants. Part of it is because sometimes the species can be difficult to identify, especially with things like cacti and succulents. There's just so much crossbreeding. It can be really difficult to figure out exactly what species you have, but the genus will carry you far enough. There can be instances where certain species can require very different care, but in general, knowing the genus and knowing how to care for plants within that genus, you'll do fine. An example would be like Ficus pumila. Ficus pumila takes very different care from the rest of the ficus plants because it needs so much more water. It needs humidity. So it can be like one of those exceptions. Anyway, have we done everything? I think we did everything. So let's do a quick recap. So the 7 levels of taxonomy, starting at the top, and we're going to use this one as an example. Kingdom, Plantae. Phylum, this is Magnoliophyta because it's the flowering plants. Most of our house plants are in Magnoliophyta, except for ferns, which are in Polypodiophyta, and there's a couple plants that are in Cycadophyta. Other than that, it's all Magnoliophyta. The next step down is class, which is going to be one of 2, Liliopsida or Magnoliopsida. This one is in Magnoliopsida because it's a complex flowering plant. Next step down is order. Order doesn't matter as much because order doesn't give us enough information about certain plants. But this is in the order Roseales. Now, the next step down from that is family, and family is important because it can tell us how different genera relate together. This is in the family Moraceae, which doesn't do us a lot of good because there's not really any other houseplants in Moraceae that I can think of. And then the next step down from that is the most important one, the genus, that kind of identifies the plant, which you'll see in stores and just kind of helps you name the plant in general. And then the last step is species. It's the most specific, smallest one, and it just tells you what specific plant you have within the genus. That is Linnaean taxonomy in a nutshell. A lot of you might have already known a lot of this information. A lot of this could be new to you guys, but it is very interesting. And I encourage you, if it's something that you're interested in, I encourage you to do more research. But just beware that you might find different names for certain things, and you might find that certain websites or certain scientists have different opinions about how something should be placed or organized. And even if you get on Wikipedia, it can be a little bit tricky because you start seeing words like tribes and subgenera and clades and things like that. I just don't get into that because it muddies the waters, so to speak. But yeah, I think that's really about it about taxonomy. One other thing before we go. If you noticed when I was naming things, you'll notice the suffix, which is the last part of a word. You'll notice that the levels can be organized by different suffixes. Suffixes? What is the plural of suffix? So the phylum all end in the suffix phyta, Magnoliophyta, Lycopodiophyta. The classes all end in opsida, Opsida, Liliopsida, Magnoliopsida. The orders all end in ales, Ales, and the families all end in AC, uh, ACEAE. Once you get down into the genus, it's variable. Like, the genus and the species will have different names because those are the ones that are usually named after people or after places or after just different things. They may not be named after that. They could be named after whatever family they're in. It just sort of depends. But if you notice those patterns with the suffixes, it'll help you when you come across those words. But yeah, I think that's all I have about taxonomy. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it. I enjoy talking about this stuff. I think it's important to know names. So something to think about. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for contributing. I'm excited to see what some of your comments are about this. Please fill in some of the gaps if you think I missed anything that I should have said. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming along with me on the journey and everything. And until the next video, I will see you guys very soon. Thank you.